A pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater. Hi, I'm movie geek Father Andrew Miller.
And I'm cinema lover Reverend Michelle Byerly.
And this is A Pastor and a Priest Walk Into a Movie Theater, a podcast about faith, life, and the silver screen. Today we're going to be discussing the 2006 fantasy film, The Fountain.
And for those of you who have not seen it, we encourage you to do so because we will be getting into spoilers and plot. Essentially, this is a love story across the centuries, is one way to interpret it. You have the main story happens kind of current day with this research doctor and his wife who is dying. And then you have the 1500s conquistador and Queen Isabella. And then you have the futuristic character as well. And they are played by Hugh Jackman and Rachel Weisz. So that's kind of the gist of the story. There are different interpretations as far as what's actually happening with these stories. That's part of what's interesting about it today, but that's kind of the general synopsis. So we'll get started from there.
I thought it was an absolutely brilliant film. Like I absolutely enjoyed this. And honestly, I thought the fact that it was open to so many different levels of interpretation it was part of its brilliance. And listener, I just need to say off the bat that if there are aspects, if you've seen the film and there are aspects we're missing out, please comment on it, because there is no way to capture every aspect of this movie in a single hour-long podcast. This movie is full of symbolism, and there's a lot going on, and it's just not possible to talk about all of it. And of course, being Christians, there's going to be some blinders on both of us, so we would invite those of you either who are Christians or not to sort of help us to find our blinders and catch what symbolism we're not catching. So
yeah, and I did want to start with that caveat. I'm glad you went there because it has a lot of different symbolism. It gets into the knowledge of other faith traditions. Particularly the Mayan tradition is a very strong one. And so I'm just going to come out there and say, I only know of the Mayan tradition what we hear in the movie. And so I would, if someone is more familiar and can speak to those things, we would love to engage on that. And just ask for some grace to say, sort of like our disclaimer with the Moana, we know that we're not part of that tradition. And we know that there's always a fallacy in trying to compare one zone to another, but just that we draw those parallels. I'll say it that way.
Yeah, I think what struck me, and this is from my time as a palliative care chaplain and a chaplain on the cancer on the cancer unit, is that the film is about palliative care more than it is.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, and that's, of course, that it's a very subjective movie. The film could be said to be about many things primarily, but what hit me was that it was primarily about palliative care and how we redefine hope in midst of certain death.
Yes. And that was kind of the lens that I viewed it through as well, because I did also serve some time as a chaplain on a hematology oncology unit. And then I won't probably go too deep into my own story on this, but I have lived that experience with my own family of walking that experience of losing someone to cancer, and just some of the small, slow deaths that you walk with along the way of grief. And we can get into that as we go along, but yeah, this one definitely hit home for me. And I'll also say we're recording this a day before 10 years that I lost a family member to cancer. And so it's kind of and again, part of it is my story, part of it's not, and so I'll honor that element, but it definitely flavored the lens through which I see this as well.
You're welcome, and I'm sure you know this, but I just want to affirm that, of course, you're welcome to tell or not tell that story. So yeah, just from my perspective, there is a sense, and I encountered this working on the palliative care team at KU Hospital. There is a something called toxic hope, a sense,
Yes.
and I felt that was expressed by name, in fact, when the character played by Hugh Jackman was going back to his office to continue research on a potentially life-saving miracle cure to not only cancer per se. I can't remember if they say that she's actually dying from cancer, but
yeah, she has brain tumors.
okay, so it's probably cancer, but it's implied that the practical applications of this cure, which also come from a tree in Central America, and the symbolism of the tree of life is very present in all three of the settings of the movie. But it's implied that the healing power of this tree could potentially relationship between life and death. And what but anyways, where I was going with that is that he says to Izzy, his wife, before he leaves, there's good hope, right? He says there's hope that you can survive, and saw that as a kind of toxic hope, because oftentimes what is needed when someone is dying, and on palliative care, or care wherein we treat the symptoms, not the problem, because the problem is untreatable, is a redefinition of hope. And I felt that this is what the film offers. On the other hand, I wonder if the kind of hope that it offers is heresy, given, and this asks a question. I mean, so we are Christians, we have a definite view of afterlife, in which, at least I have, I'm not sure what your theology afterlife, but I tend to go with the traditional understanding of the afterlife, that my consciousness and even my body will continue eternally. And yet, on the other hand, I wonder if that is a kind of toxic hope, abstracted from the present life into the afterlife. Okay, now I can accept my own death, because my own individual consciousness and even my body will continue in the resurrection.
Well, and for me, one of the big thoughts as I was watching this movie, so a lot of it is about how we come to terms with death and dying. And to me, it seems like a lot of theology and religion and faith is about addressing that issue of our mortality. And we try to make sense of what it means to be a person who has a finite time here physically on earth. What happens after someone dies, and so I think different faiths come to different conclusions about what that looks like. As a Christian, I believe that death has been overcome in victory through Christ. We believe that. I also, part of me tries not to get so hung up on the after that I forget about the here and now. I think that part of my faith teaches me what is it to live in the here and now, and to create these small moments of heaven here and now. And I think that's part of this too. I think that is part of the answer of hope, is that hope is taking a walk in the snow, on the first snow, with your wife, which is kind of a recurring theme in the movie. She says, "Hey, there's snow, come walk with me." And the first time around he doesn't. Later on he does, and that seems to almost break the cycle,
The
so to
symbolism
speak.
of that moment, I think, is linked intimately with the symbolism of his losing his ring. And
Yeah.
he's so passionate about trying to save her life that he loses her in the process, that he loses what little he's so caught up in the toxic hope of trying to increase the amount of time that she has left, the amount of time that he gets to spend with her, that he loses the quality of the time that he has left.
Yeah.
And so he's unable to redefine hope.
To the point where even after she's died, he is still
Caught up in that.
he's still trying to revive her. He's still, he almost chokes out one of the doctors.
Well, he says
Mhm.
death is a disease like any
Disease.
other, and
And
that
it
is
can be
toxic
cured.
hope.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it can
So
be cured like any other. I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to ask. So that leads me to, what is our theology of death?
It's interesting, and I think. Oh, by the way, listener, you might have gotten used to our editor Wesley, kind of breaking in with da da dum bum 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 ba ba. He's about to do that now. I think that this film is well, in addition to being about palliative care, and by the way, he might have already broken in to define that term. But this film is about soteriology, or the doctrine of salvation.
Mm.
In other words, it's about what salvation looks like. Of course, a lot of Christians when they study soteriology on how Christ saves us, which is a very worthy talk, but or a very worthy study. On the other hand, what is it? What is it to be saved? What is salvation? Right, and there was an article when I very first went to seminary in Lexington, Kentucky. This would have been 2008, so long time ago. We read an article, and I've tried to look for this article. I can't remember who wrote it. I can't remember. I'm not even using the right terms here, but it basically broke down salvation into 5 types. There's forgiveness of sin. There's being at home from alienation. There's fulfillment from emptiness. There's liberation from oppression, and there's newness from the old. And it's interesting, and I put it this way because it seems to me that, well, I mean, Christianity, especially in its more evangelical expression, and I think there's truth in this, has become about going to heaven, right? You believe in Jesus so you can go to heaven. Now, I think it's a lot deeper than that, but I think that there is truth there, that salvation does involve what we might call an afterlife of going to heaven, but the film sort of offers an alternative to that, in that it sees life and death as a kind of cycle. And so the hope for an afterlife, and I think Izzy sees this, like Izzy loses her fear because she realizes this, that after she's gone, her energy continues. And death becomes a kind of new birth for her. Now, that to me is and indeed the movie mentions this. The Inquisitor in the 16th century portion of the movie attacks Queen Isabella's understanding of soteriology, although Queen Isabella's is slightly different from Izzy's. But
yeah, I was gonna say that was one thing that. So I don't know if fascinated's the right word, because she was definitely a very problematic character, or not character, but historical figure. Yeah, Queen Isabella before the Inquisitor would not likely have happened in real life.
No,
because she was like the Catholic's Catholic in real life. So.
Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting. The film's Queen Isabella of Spain is definitely not the historical Queen Isabella of Spain.
Right.
But it is interesting, the difference between her soteriology and Izzy's soteriology, which I take it to be the movie's soteriology. If the movie takes a stance, it offers us this view of life and death as cyclical, and death is sort of like in Star Wars, becoming one with the Force, becoming one with nature. And so there isn't a kind of afterlife per se. It's not in the sense that you maintain yourself and individuality and consciousness, right? But
it's
rather
that you
that
continue on into a new creation
as part of the nature.
And I like how they have the metaphor of the dying star that's wrapped in a nebula that will die and then create new stars, and then the tree, the seed that gets planted, and then later on it dies and nourishes new. And
I'm gonna kill that dog.
yeah,
Not
so
really.
it's very, you're right. You're right that it is very cyclical in its nature.
Indeed. And so you have that soteriology. That's the soteriology of Izzy, right? In the present day setting of the film. And then there is the soteriology of Isabella, which is, I think, more akin to the Doctor's soteriology in the present day. In other words, it's looking for a kind of eternal life in the present, a continuation of her individuality in the present that is just unending, right? In other words, it's not an afterlife per se, but it's also not an accepting of death. It is a view of death as something that can be cured and done away with, and that's why she sends out the conquistador Tomas. And then, of course, you have the Grand Inquisitor's soteriology, which is the traditional Christian soteriology, and part of his attack on the soteriology of the Queen is that it relies on salvation in the present tense, when our goal as Christians is to look to the afterlife.
One of the elements of symbolism, I think this might be going off in a different direction. It starts off with the passage in Genesis where Adam and Eve have been kicked out of the garden so that they can't continue to eat the fruit of the tree of life after they've eaten the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And there's a guard of an angel with a flaming sword that's placed there. And we see that parallel with the Mayan priest figure who also has a sword that's flaming. And so I found that really an interesting parallel. And then the combination of and this is like when I didn't make this connection completely until the very end, where there was this search for the fountain of youth that happened historically, and then there's this tree of life, and I had never really thought of those two things as the same thing, and this movie almost kind of treats them in that way, and that the sap is kind of that water of life. So just an interesting.
I think it's key to understanding the movie, and furthermore, well, hence the film is called The Fountain. It's about the search for the fountain of youth, which is the tree of life. But it's interesting that I wonder to what extent, and I was sort of racking my head with, okay, how does Genesis fit into this? Because of course I see the first chapters of Genesis through my Orthodox Christian lens of thinking about original sin. So I was my blinders are kind of on, but and the film really isn't about original sin per se. Well, anyway.
I mean, if you make the argument that death is the consequence of the original sin,
sure,
but that the punishment was that we would no longer be able to live in Eden with God in some sort of seeming continual communion.
Fair enough, but I also think that it invites us to see that consequence in a different way. And what's so interesting is that Tomas is the first father. I wonder if the relationship between Tomas and Izzy, or Tomas and Isabella, Tomas and Izzy, Tomas and the woman that he sees, who happens to be Izzy, in the future setting, is the relationship between Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
But the way in which I think it invites us to see death as a consequence in a different way is, I think, the way in which it offers that soteriology of death as the beginning of a new cycle.
Well, and then it's interesting you brought up first father, and I would love to learn more about that. For me, I saw a very Christological element to that, because, first father sacrifices himself so that creation can be made.
It's
which sounds like a very Christ sacrificing Christ's self so that life can be continued. And so,
yeah, it's interesting. On the one hand, it's a kind of bringing together, a synthesis of the figure of Christ as well as Adam, because I think that Tomas in that scene is very Adam-like, in the sense that, well, and I will kudos to the film that it isn't Eve who partakes of the tree of life. It's Adam. But when Adam partakes of the of the sap of the tree of life, he gets more than he bargains for. Right.
Right.
That's his Adam self. Right. He thinks that he's going to live forever, and in a sense, he is. But the price of eternal life is death, in a paradoxical sense, because
Right.
in taking the sap, he ends up killing himself as an individual, but the individual becomes part of the paradigm of life that surrounds him.
Hmm. Yeah. So another, and again, I'm sorry if I'm jumping around here. You talked about the tree itself. So he drinks the sap at one point, but then very early on in the movie, he takes a piece of the bark and he places it on his tongue. And to
Almost
me, that,
Eucharistically.
yeah, and I thought about, this is my body given for you. I thought those were the words that were going through my head as I saw that scene. I knew enough to know that there was some sort of connection of that tree to her, and so yeah, I thought that was a really interesting moment.
Well, and the film showed constantly the hairs on the tree, and sort of,
Mhm,
as well as the hairs on Izzy and the hairs on the
mhm,
woman, the kind of equating of the tree of life with the woman was,
mhm,
I think, powerful.
yeah. So, which gets me into another question. Does this then also reshape the way that we might think about our care for ecology? If we return to the earth and are reborn in new forms, but we don't treat the earth with respect, are we disrespecting our ancestors, our history, our, and so, and again, I'm going in a million directions today on this.
Which the film is very easy. It's very easy to do when you watch this film. Go off in a
Yeah,
million
yeah.
directions.
But it just made me think about that. If that tree, and actually there are people who are being buried and basically they will decompose and turn into trees. And so if you can point to that tree and say that's Granny, are you going to be as willing to chop it up or to mistreat it?
On the other hand, I wonder if part of what the film is inviting us to let go of is our ego.
Mm,
It's Granny in the sense that it contains, well, her energy, her
mm,
life, that sort of thing. On the other hand, it isn't Granny. And because, well, Granny's sense of individuality, my sense of individuality, doesn't have to continue.
yeah.
And that is, I think, um, what Tomas the Conquistador was forced into when he takes the sap and then dies. And then Thomas, the doctor, sort of, as well as the future self, sort of come to accept that their individuality do not have to go on. Well, Thomas accepts
Mhm.
that Izzy's individuality doesn't have to go on. Izzy's ego doesn't have to go on. And then Thomas, the future self, accepts that his ego doesn't have to go on as
Mhm.
he encounters the star and dies in the lotus position, I should say.
Yes, I was gonna point that out too. When they have that scene where he kind of floats up and assumes that, it's like, ooh, we are getting into a lot of different faiths and philosophies, and um, there is very much a synthesis of a lot of different faith groups together, I think.
And it is that synthesis, in my view, that we need to pull into the study of soteriology.
Hmm.
We need to and I'm clearly influenced by the German or philosopher Gottfried Hegel, but I think all five of the types of soteriology, as well as the type of soteriology in which the self ceases to be the self in the truest sense of the term, need to be brought into a kind of oneness. That
Hmm.
it is true that salvation for the Christian involves the resurrection of the body, and the continuation of the soul, the self.
Well,
Added.
and even Paul says it's not I, but Christ who lives in me.
Bingo. And Paul also, when his Hellenistic-minded audience sort of recoils at the idea of a resuscitated corpse, when they ask, well, what do you mean, the resurrection? You mean we're really resuscitating corpses? And Paul says, wrong question. And that's the essence of his claim. What is sown in flesh is raised in spirit. And that doesn't mean that the physical flesh is bad or doesn't continue. It is rather that, yes, yourself continues in the afterlife, but it also doesn't.
And it's transformed.
Yes.
For this perishable body must put on imperishability. This mortal body must put on immortality. Those are the words I use at gravesides and funerals all the time.
Salvation is forgiveness of sin and everlasting life and an afterlife where you are happy.
And it's freedom from bondage, because remember, her question to him is, will you free Spain from bondage?
Yes.
And I don't think it's about Spain. I think it's about him. Will you be free from this fear that you have?
Editor Wesley here. Here we are at the halfway point of the show, and while Reverend Michelle and Father Andrew have mentioned me a few times, they haven't actually made any references without then explaining themselves, so I haven't had to interrupt with any definitions. I'm so proud. Anyway, I'd just like to say that if you're enjoying A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater, please consider joining us in our online discussions on Facebook on the New Faith New Media discussion group at www.facebook.com/groups/NFNM group. And also please check out our sister podcast, Faith and What Resonates, hosted by Gail Gallagher, who composed and performed all the music for A Pastor and a Priest, and who suggested The Fountain for today's episode. If you really like what we're doing, please consider becoming a patron of New Faith New Media at patreon.com/NFNM at either the $2, $4, or $10 a month levels. Thank you very much, and happy listening.
It's interesting, though. I think that the traditional paradigm of salvation as being about the eternal continuation of the self, if you will, which is really embraced by the Grand Inquisitor, is, I think, depicted in the film as antithetical to understanding salvation in the truest sense of the term, in that it is a kind of, I think the film makes a connection between the Grand Inquisitor's understanding of salvation and Isabella's understanding of salvation, the Queen. Both want the self to continue. One wants the self to continue in this life. The other hopes for the self to continue in the next life. I think that the film might be a little bit unfair in that regard, in that perhaps one has to dare oneself to think in the both and sense that, yeah, the Inquisitor is right, but Isabella's right too, in this sense, because salvation is forgiveness of sins, but it's also liberation from oppression. It's also what Jesus says, the fulfillment from emptiness, when Jesus says, I came that you may have life and have it abundantly, fulfillment from emptiness. It's also living, being at home from alienation, living in this joyful community in this life and the next. It's also sort of the newness from old, the getting it, the evolution from the mundane into the holiness, and all of these things operate together. And then Christian theology of salvation, Christian soteriology, becomes about understanding how Christ leads us to all of them.
Yeah, which, and again, this all comes back to, as you were describing all of that, it gets us back to, what does hope look like in a palliative care situation? You know, what does it look like to make the most of the moments you have with someone who you know is dying? You know, what does it mean to savor those moments that you have together with your loved one? And that's another theme that I we haven't really talked yet about, for me, part of this is also the eternity of love,
Mm.
and how, he says, you pulled me across time. And I really think, so here's part of my theology. A lot comes from First John, where it talks about God is love, and love is creative, God is creative. And so there is something about the love itself that is a common thread through these stories.
Well, yeah, and the love between, I wonder if part of the reason why they're played by the same actors is because in a very real sense they are the same person just over
Exactly.
time, and that's not a simplistic reincarnation per se.
Mhm.
Rather, it is that love transcends time, even the flow of time, and the fact
Exactly.
that the three settings sort of weave themselves together. You don't get the first setting and then the second setting and then the third setting. They're woven
Yeah. They're all at the
together,
same, it's like they're all at the same time in some sense.
which is a presentation of synthesis as well. That
Mhm.
that in a sense, and this is actual Christian doctrine, that in a sense it isn't the case that heaven is unending, right? It is rather the case that heaven is, and this comes from a Christian philosopher by the name of Boethius. It is rather that heaven is atemporal. It is all time occurring at once. It is a
God is the Alpha and the Omega, the
right.
beginning and the end.
It is a synthesis. It is the synthesis of past and future and present into one. I can make all things one. So
Yeah. God is the God of all that is, was, and ever will be.
which I think is there's a psychology here at play, having been formed in evangelical Christianity by other places, of fear, that I resist, although I find it beautiful. I sort of resist at a visceral level this understanding of death as meaning these other things beyond simply just the continuation of my flesh and soul for forever. Because I'm not really sure what's going on there, but it's not reason. It's my psychology of when I hear of death as something that means that I will be a profoundly different person in the afterlife, that fills me with fear.
Um, so some movies I tend to view through a pastor lens. This one I definitely viewed more through a chaplain lens.
Mm.
And one of the things that ever since I've become a chaplain and I'm watching movies or medical shows, one of the questions I am always screaming at the screen is, where is the chaplain?
Mm.
Because and this movie I did it too, because I'm like, especially during that time of death, I think that it would have been, it seemed like it was pretty sudden, but even still, you would have had some alerting. There was a code that was called. Where is the chaplain? I liked the scene where the head doctor over Thomas, she's there with Izzy, and they're holding hands and they're laughing and reminiscing and whatnot. And it's, to me, that is kind of a chaplain moment. But I would have liked to have seen more of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was gonna say I thought that she really played the role of the chaplain in the
Yeah,
film.
exactly.
And well, I mean the office of chaplain I think is so misunderstood
Hmm.
by people who, by religious persons and non-religious persons alike. The office of the chaplain is thought of as, well, the minister who brings God to the dying, when in a very evangelical sense, and that's really not what the chaplain. Well, it is what the chaplain does, but in a very different way than you might understand.
Hmm.
But No, you're right, and I, as I was witnessing that scene, I realized that I, as Elie Wiesel with The Day After, I realized I'd seen that film before a million times when I was on call and had to go to codes.
Yeah. Well, and for me, I would have been definitely working with the husband to work through those struggles. You know, she, I think, it's interesting. Even she had a bit of a journey herself, because at first she's scared,
Mm-hmm.
and I think about. So this is where it gets a little more personal again. That part where she's out on the patio or whatever, and it's snowing, and they look down and she doesn't have her shoes on.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go in, she takes a bath, she asks him to warm the sponge, and she can't feel it. The oh crap of that moment, I can kind of resonate with. I know what it's like to have a family member who you keep getting, I think I said it earlier, it's like these little small deaths along the way, and it just, you keep losing things, sensation, or when someone isn't able to walk, or I mean, just those elements of, it's not just that end moment of grief, it's those little moments of grief along the way.
Yeah.
And you see that in her, and you see her go from this place of, she says, I'm scared, to eventually, I'm not afraid anymore. And she's come to a sense of peace about it. He hasn't. And his journey is kind of longer. It takes him through the course of the movie to kind of get to that point.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks who are dying come to that sense of peace before their family do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Which speaks, I think, to the love.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't really speak to your story. The reason why, in my case, with the family members that I know who have died, was because I loved them. So I wanted them to continue with me. So it took me a lot longer.
We grieve because we have loved.
Yeah.
Grief, I have often come to say, grief is the price we pay for love. And I know that's not original to me, and I've heard it a lot of different places, but it's truly, we grieve because we've loved someone.
Amen.
Amen. And so I think it's hard to have love without grief, and it's hard to have grief without love. And so for me, it's oddly, I can kind of get a sense of people who have truly experienced grief, because it does transform you. And I think that someone who has grieved, you see how it, for me, grief has become kind of a companion on the journey versus something that is to be feared or pushed aside. You can tell those people who have made that peace with their grief. So, and the first way it usually comes is they're not trying to have that toxic hope and those platitudes that we like to throw out because we don't know what else to say. And I used to say some of those things too. And even after I've walked grief, I'm sure I slip into some of them sometimes.
There's truth in them, I think. On the other hand, I think they can be shallow. They can prevent us from seeing a little bit more of the depth of what's going on.
Well, and in some sense, I think some of them are trying to just anesthetize the pain instead of letting you feel it.
Yeah.
Which is ultimately more healthy. I always remember, we were encouraged to say death, dying, dead, instead of they passed on, they went to a better place, they expired, and just how difficult for some people using those words actually is.
Yes.
And this is me going off on my diatribe about Americans and our difficulty with facing with facing death and dying, and how much we try to put it off, how much we chase that fountain of youth. And that's why I say, what is our theology of death? Because I don't think most people have sat down and wrestled with that.
Well, I don't think, I mean, as I'm sort of doing a meta-analysis of this conversation, I don't think I have, because you asked, I went off, this whole conversation has been my own sort of pontification on theology of salvation, but you asked about death, theology of death, not theology of salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Those are different things. And I don't know if I have much of a theology of death per se, in the sense or understanding death as true finitude, true end. Death is the end.
Mm-hmm.
What comes to mind, and this is one of those tried aphorisms or platitudes, but it's what comes to mind. So mea culpa is what St. Francis of Assisi is thought to have said, "Thou most kind and gentle death, waiting to hush our latest breath, thou leadest home the child of God, and Christ our Lord thy way hath trod." And for me, that's a beginning for future reflection, but it certainly is a bit trite and aphoristic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How are you doing?
I'm good. No, I'm just thinking, like I said, I've kind of, because grief has become a companion on the journey in a way death kind of has too. So I think of the Emily Dickinson, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me.
The story of the three brothers in Harry Potter.
Yes. Oh my gosh, and that's kind of where I think I got the companion on the journey a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It's not exactly correct, but I think I kind of took it from there and kind of looked at it that way, because really that story is about how we approach death. Do we try to tackle it and become the causers of others' death so that we don't? Do we try to undo it because we've experienced it? Or do we maybe, I won't say hide from it, but live our life and then later on accept it and become its companion at the end?
Yeah, I love the third brother who it almost seems at first glance like he's trying to hide from death. Well, actually he's not.
Mm-hmm.
He's playing with death. And the
Yeah.
third brother is so
Yeah.
playful. He's
Yeah.
and finally when he gets
Hide and seek.
when he works the courage, he takes off the cloak and they embrace his brothers. And I wonder if grief
Mhm.
functions the same way.
Yeah,
Of that, there comes
I
a
think
point in
so.
which grief becomes the memory,
Mhm.
the blessed memory that it's the thing that reminds you of how much you love that person and all the wonderful things that you did with that person.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, and then I think about all of the different ways that we've portrayed death over time. There's fiction that engages that. There's Meet Joe Black, which I hope we do at some point. There's the hammer and sickle of time, or not the hammer and sickle, but the sickle, the black hooded figure. And then there's the seventh seal, where death plays a game of chess or whatever with the character.
mm-hmm.
So yeah, it is just interesting to see how those, but they're all intertwined: death, grief, salvation, life.
Well, I think all of religion is in some sense a response to the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And death, I think, is the problem of death, if you want to call it a problem, is an extension of the problem of evil. Why do people who don't deserve to die, who deserve to have long and fulfilling lives, why do they die? And
Yeah.
if
Yeah,
God,
that quote from Gandalf: some who die deserve to live, and some who live deserve to die, but it is not for us to decide that.
I'm not sure that's the exact. Is that the exact quote?
It's not. I'm sure it's not the exact quotation, but
Well, if we're gonna quote someone such as Gandalf, I think I'm sorry. I feel it necessary to, because I'm a big Tolkien fan. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. So, sorry, I didn't mean to.
no, you're good. You're good. I'm glad that you.
So, if you were writing a sermon on this film, what would be the takeaway for your congregation?
The takeaway, I think, would be to encourage people to have those conversations about death and dying. What are your wishes as you approach death? I think talking to our loved ones, I think that's so important. What are our wishes? What are our desires given the time that we have? And then the other thing, I think, my instinct was almost like, would this be a good Easter illustration and kind of a contrast? It's not exact, because there's a lot more to it, but that was just what was coming to my mind.
I guess I would honestly, I would love to show this film to a congregation, and I would love to. I would show this film to anyone who wants to work in palliative care or hospice. And I think that the takeaway for a sermon, if I were to write on it, write one on it, would be that one has to confront the reality of death. One cannot. We can have our understanding of eternal life and resurrection, but one cannot understand those things in such a way that prevents us from confronting the reality of death as finitude. That what it means is that we cease to be. And then we can, once we embrace that, we can start to redefine hope.
So. Yeah, I would agree. All right. Well, we are going to be wrapping up season 1 here and take a brief hiatus. We will be letting you know when we'll be coming back. I think, if I remember correctly, September.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wes, you might do one of your da-da-da-bum-bum-bum-ba-dum things at this moment just to tell the audience what the plan is, because see, I won't speak for Michelle on this one, but I am just kind of focused on talking about movies. I have a difficult time, and I'm mea culpa, it's my problem. I have a difficult time focusing in on the plan for New Faith, New Media. So mea culpa.
Yeah. And I'm going to be moving, so that makes it like a little disruption here.
Yeah. Do you want to
tell the last time? I think this will be the last time that I'll be recording from here.
Do you want to tell the? I'm not sure if you consider it good news. United Methodists have a doctrine of itinerancy, which is quite wonderful. It's a doctrine. Do you want to tell the listeners what's going on in your life, Reverend Michelle?
Yeah. So I will be moving up to south central Nebraska in a couple of weeks, and so part of our hiatus is so that I can get moved and transitioned, and so that's another. Sorry, I'm adding on a little bit here, but that's another piece of this whole thing for me is grief is not just about physical death either. It's about these other changes and transitions, and so part of what I'm doing is similar to what you would do in end of life of, thinking back, what am I most proud of? Did I make a difference?
Did you talk about communism?
Yeah. So, and then also looking into the new in the future. So. Anyway.
So we don't actually have another video or another movie that we're.
Yeah, we will, as we know more, we'll let you know what our next movie is going to be. But as of recording, we do not know at this time. So, because all my movies are going to be packed very soon.
She still has the old DVDs. Like wow, she's a Luddite.
I am a Luddite.
My wife's got me on board with streaming, and I don't even touch my DVDs anymore. I barely know where they all are.
So, all right. Anything else for the good of the cause? Okay. So we are so glad that you have joined us today. Thank you for joining us on A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater. We were edited, and definitions and scripture readings were provided by Wesley Morrison Sloat, and our music was composed and recorded by Gail Gallagher. A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater is a production of New Faith, New Media. If you like what you've seen here, please check out NFNM's other podcast, Faith and What Resonates, hosted by Gail Gallagher and others as we announce them. If you really like what you've heard, please like the New Faith, New Media group on Facebook and consider becoming a Patreon of NFNM at www.patreon.com/NFNM. Patrons gain access to our private comedy roundtable show, Blessed Lunatics, in which the hosts of both podcasts, along with editor Wesley, riff on a variety of subjects and seek to access the divine through laughter.